Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm actually overwhelmed that there's so much interest in this. This project has come along in perfect timing when I've pretty much finished most of the other big things that I've been working on, but I'd always had this nagging suspicion that I hadn't quite finished at the archives. And this is the story of the next stage. This is the very faint map that I started with, and it's Baker's 1846 map of Moreton Bay, Darling Downs, the Clarence districts. Very significant that it covers all three of those. So what I'm going to be doing, I'll just give you a very brief overview. I've only got 20 minutes to talk about it today. Just the project that I'm working on, and leave time for question and answers. But I do want to talk a little bit about the records as well, because the records are what make this place fantastic. This is a world-class repository. These are documents you can't find in a lot of other countries or a lot of other states, okay? Couple of issues that I've had to consider with this project, and some of them I'm still working through. Who's going to end up using this project? All right, how am I going to communicate the information that I've found? So there's a number of opportunities for web pages, for apps, but essentially this is an education tool. I am hoping that people will use the information that I create in this to actually know and understand a little bit more about this part of the world and its immediate history. And as a professional historian, I'm afraid I have to actually stress the fact that this is real history. This is not just a story I've made up, pretending. These are records that are held here in this building, okay? These are records that were created 150 years ago plus by individuals who were actually part of making history, okay? So that's the first thing. There are some technical limitations. How reliable is that map? How accurate was Mr. Baker in drawing the roads and the place names? And of course the answer is not 100%. Compared with our modern mapping, which is, really quite, fantastic. We can basically measure down to the metre nowadays using GPS. So we do have an issue that the base data that I'm using, the maps, the documents, sometimes are a little bit vague. It'll say, oh yeah, this happened on so-and-so road or on so-and-so creek, and it won't give you an exact location. And of course, using modern GPS software, we can give an exact location. So one of the technical issues that I'm grappling with is how do I actually geolocate these events, these records? The final one is ethics. What happens if I identify the site of a native police massacre and it happens to be in somebody's backyard? What are people going to think if they realise that they're living on top of somewhere where a lot of Aboriginal people were buried? Okay, it's going to be very distressing for them, even though they probably bought the place with no awareness of it at all. So there is some issues, okay? There are problems that I'm dealing with as well. I've started with a whole set of technical things, and it's great that they don't teach you this at university, so you have to learn it for yourself. I wish they did. But this is one example that I have used successfully, and it basically, you create a spreadsheet of places, you give in a latitude and a longitude, and you then push go on the software and it creates an overlay on Google Earth. Okay, so it'll put a little flag on your map in front of you. The other one that I'm using though is actually using a dedicated GPS device. And in my case, it's a Garmin, And with a Garmin you can actually create a whole network of routes and place marks as well. So there are some options that I'm still working on, but this is bulletproof. This is just so simple, this one. EarthPoint, there are a number of these commercial providers out there. I'm still looking for an open source, and that would be the holy grail if I could find that. Okay. So that covers the technical side of things, I hope. We can move on to the actual documents. Now, this project that I'm working on is essentially based on 7 series of records about the Native Police held here at State Archives. And they are a mixture of supply orders, accounts, bank statements and other general correspondence for the period between 1848 and 1857. There's an interesting story, and you're going to have to stop me when I start digressing. For many, many years, these records have been available here on microfilm, but they were very poorly microfilmed, very hard to read. One day I was speaking with one of the archivists and I said, gee, it'd be really nice to see these much clearer. And she said, leave it with me. And an hour later she came back and she said, the originals are upstairs, I've just been looking at them. And I was just dumbstruck, you know. All these years we've been using these illegible records and wondering where they came from. And the story behind them is even more intriguing. Somebody in the New South Wales State Archives transferred it to Queensland in the 1980s to get rid of it. They said, oh, we didn't have any Native Police, we don't want these, send the lot to Queensland. And I don't think people realised what they were sitting on. And of course, when I'd looked at these many years ago, I was looking for evidence of violence, because I'm sorry to say, violence and poverty, for me, are why we study history. They are the most important things that affect people. They are the things that trickle down through the generations. And if you inflict violence and poverty on people, as was the case with Aboriginal people, it will have huge, huge implications. You look at a record like that and you think, oh, there's no violence there. Why would you bother? Okay? But of course, as you get a little bit older, you realise that records tell us a whole lot more than just about violence. This is a bill from a hotel keeper. Frederick Walker, Esquire, was the first commandant of the Native Police, appointed in 1848. And this tells you how much he's been drinking in one night. And there was always this question about Frederick Walker. Was he really an alcoholic, or was that just a story that people spread about him? Okay? Well, I think when you look at that, he starts off with, you know, paying for his meals and bed. Yep, fair enough. Then we get, how many? 8 bottles of wine, a bottle of champagne, and it just goes on and on. So all of a sudden, I now understand a whole lot more about Frederick Walker. Okay, I can tell you a lot more about what kind of man was he, because when we look at history, if we can understand things like diet and recreation, we get a much better picture, a much richer understanding of those people. They're not just these faceless, two-dimensional characters. This is a bloke who rode a horse around southeast Queensland supervising the Native Police, and at night, what did he do? He went to the hotel and he drank a reasonable amount. I can't imagine drinking that much, but I think for some people they would just say, oh, that's nothing. But it's interesting that it's for 2. And I suggest to you that the second unnamed person is an Aboriginal trooper, and his job is to look after the horse. Okay? So immediately we've got a way of locating an individual at a particular point in time and at a particular space. Sadly, of course, it just says Gatton. all right? So we don't actually know. I mean, as you can see, there's a little bit torn off there. So it's frustrating. Now, just to carry on, the Native Police formed in 1848 by New South Wales. Okay, so for anyone in New South Wales to deny the Native Police is wrong. Okay, the same as anyone who denies there was this kind of violence on the frontier is wrong. You only have to walk in this place and look at the records. And it's the McIntyre River on the Darling Downs that really is the reason why the Native Police comes into being in this part of the world. There had been a previous Native Police force at Port Phillip. The government thought, this is working, it's very cheap, this is what we need on the frontier. So the Governor Fitzroy in New South Wales, he said that he's heard that there are certain collisions having taken place. So he said, right, let's get the squatters to pay for this Native Police force. Walker arrives on the McIntyre in 1849 and he writes saying, what am I supposed to do? And the answer he was told, you escort the drays that are going to stations, you're to visit the stations, you're to assist the settlers during floods. But of course, his primary function is to crush any kind of resistance to colonisation, right? And this is a story about violence. This is a story of extreme violence. This is a story about killing Aboriginal people who are an impediment to European annexation of Australia. In the beginning, the Native Police just consisted of Walker, one white non-commissioned officer, a sergeant, and 10 troopers. But it rapidly increases, so that at its peak in the early 1880s, there are about 200 troopers, at least 100 to 150 Europeans served as officers in the Native Police under either New South Wales and as Queensland. And the primary means of operation is by patrolling. The Native Police respond if there's news of an attack somewhere. Somebody will write a letter, they'll all jump on their horses and race off there. But mostly they're just patrolling. And what these records actually tell us is so much about these patrols. So I can now use those records and the maps to create a much richer picture. Where were the Native Police patrolling? When did they go there? How long did they go there? How many were there? And what were they doing while they were there? So I can marry these records up with the recorded instances of violence and we can actually get a richer picture. Some of the records in this series are just calculations. And one day I'm thinking I might actually be able to work out what that's referring to. Okay, by the mid-1850s, Native Police detachments were patrolling not only southeast Queensland and the Darling Downs, but they'd reached up to the Fitzroy and Port Curtis. And I'll just share with you the story of the Trayland Native Police camp on the Burnett River. And if you stop at the Serratidus rest area, anyone know where I'm talking about? Yeah. Oh, look at that, isn't that great? If you stop in that rest area, there is a history display telling you about how the Native Police offered sanctuary to travellers right from the 1850s. How would you feel being an Aboriginal person stopping at that rest area? No, not very good at all. Okay, the area that I'm talking about then is about 300,000 square kilometres. Most of the detachments had no fixed camp. They just constantly patrolled. So they lived in the bush. In fact, the Aboriginal troopers often were the main source of food from bush tucker. Okay? I suspect that's one of the reasons why they had so much difficulty with the officers. And officer after officer wrote letters into their superiors saying, why do I have to live like this? In the bush, camping rough, eating bush tucker, going literally weeks and weeks without any other kind of civilised company. And one of the really scary things is how much they drank. I mean, how much men drank in general in those days. And they'd often, yes, I've been drinking all day long, but I wasn't drunk at all. So, like Frederick Walker and his hotel bill from Gatton. Walker's hotel bill, 2 meals and bed, 6 gills of brandy, 8 bottles of wine, 1 bottle of champagne, 2 feeds of corn, 2 horses stabling and hay, water and the groom, and 2 glasses of brandy at the end, I think probably when he got the bill. The calculation sheet, I reckon that probably refers to things like flour, sugar, tobacco, soap and salt. These are the things that are most often mentioned in these invoices. And it gives you an insight into what these men were living on. This is what they took in their saddlebags. This one is an account from W.C. Wentworth. We all know who he is? No? Oh dear. We don't teach Australian history anymore, do we? W.C. Wentworth was a colonial politician. Okay, he actually rose to a very high rank in the New South Wales Parliament, but he was also one of the major kind of movers and shakers of turning Australia from a convict settlement into this land of opportunity for people from Western Europe. He's an important character, so you're going to have to go and Google him. But in this invoice, you'll see Negro tobacco and colonial tobacco. And I'll let you think about who gets what, okay? And one of the things that I've recognised through all my research is how right through to the 20th century, Europeans thought giving Aboriginal people tobacco was an effective payment for land or just as a gift. If you ever wonder why Aboriginal people have one of the highest smoking rates in Australia, here's the clues, the beginnings of it. The other thing that these records do contain are things like warrants. And this is really significant because the native police did not function like a normal police force. They are not sworn to uphold the law. They do not have any part in justice and law and order. But very occasionally they would be given a warrant to go out and arrest an Aboriginal person. Most of the time they just shot them dead, all right? The significance of this one is it's actually signed by J.C. Wickham. James Wickham, we all know, government resident, Newstead House, etc., etc. This is one of those documents you could never read because of the microfilm was so dark. But now we can not only get who issued the warrant, but we can actually see who it's for and whereabouts. And it's at Pine Mountain out near Ipswich. The arrest of Papulia for robbery with violence. And while we're also talking about Ipswich, here's a letter from Mr. Cribb, one of the first storekeepers at Ipswich. And he's writing to Commandant Walker. He says there's been a mail robbery, but a very large parcel of the orders was found by the blacks near Ipswich. I send a guarantee to make you perfectly safe. I mean, I think you could spend your life untangling what this letter is referring to. Where was it found? Who found it? Who stole it? And why did he say, I will make you perfectly safe? Okay, so as with most research, most of these documents raise more questions than answers, all right? Next one. This is Pine Mountain. This is Hugh McGowan's statement. And I suspect it relates to that arrest warrant. But, again, a lot more work needed to be done. I love that, these are really quite old and fragile records. But they have been scanned beautifully and they now are so legible, they can tell us so much. So I am really, really grateful to the archives staff, and I can't stress that enough, that not only is this a world-class repository and a world-class document collection, but it actually has some fantastic staff who work here. And I probably would not have been able to do the work I did without them. So thank you. This is really exciting, and this was one of those documents that I'd wanted to read for a long time. None of you can see it. This is a list of articles issued to every trooper in the Native Police. Every trooper has a belt. Every trooper has a saddle, a bridle and a carbine, a rifle, and sundry other items. Some of them are issued with pistols and handcuffs. And that's a whole nother story, how Aboriginal people quickly acquired the skills to ride horses, shoot guns, to become these absolutely deadly operatives for the British. So there's always people ask me questions, did they have swords? You know, these kind of things answer that question. Next one is an invoice from Mr. Markwell in North Brisbane. And those of you who know a little bit about our early history, North Brisbane is the CBD. 24 pairs of drill trousers, 22 white shirts, 25 pairs of drill trousers. These are troopers' uniforms. This is the clothing that the troopers were given. But then we get to Mr. Walker again, and he's at South Brisbane in 1854. He's drinking soda, brandy, he's smoking cigars, he's drinking claret, and he sends all these invoices down to Sydney to get paid. Okay, this doesn't come out of his own pocket. I don't know what we'd call that today. And then we get to the Rose Inn at Gatton. Now this is really exciting because I can actually identify the location of the Rose Inn, and I can say, right, you know, on this particular night, at this particular date, Commandant Walker stayed the night there, and he had a detachment because there's 22 pounds of beef, dinner for 16 men, tea for 12 men, tobacco, flour and sugar. It just goes on and on. Walker is dismissed in 1854 after there'd been a number of complaints about him. Well, considering what we now know about how much he was drinking, I'm surprised he lasted that long. So this is actually a letter from Bligh, John O'Connell Bligh. You know, I've run out of time. I could spend 20 minutes just talking about Mr. Bligh, who became a commandant. He's talking about an escaped convict, John Fay, alias Canberry, been living among the Aborigines up on the Upper Mary, and he went and arrested him in 1854. We have a saddlery account. Very important, anything to do with the horses. And I was really excited by this one, the Bank of New South Wales at North Brisbane. And this could be the earliest bank statement ever issued in Queensland. So there's a whole story there about the Native Police. There are huge amounts of information in these records, which I can now locate. I can actually put on a mark on a map and say, this is where they came from, this is where they were going. And I'll just finish with another illegible map, but this was one of the first maps I ever found here at QSA, and again it's on the map kiosk if you want a copy of it. This is fantastic because this shows the location of the stations and of the roads. So these are the kind of basic documents that I'm using in this project, translating to a modern mapping platform, and I can actually say, righto, the Native Police were here, there and everywhere. So thank you for coming, thank you for listening, and I really do look forward to answering the questions that you have.